Hello and welcome to episode 61 of the Virtual Velo Podcast with me, Emma Martin, and my co-host, Chris Schwenker. Now, it's a cracker. It's the final show, Chris, of 2024. I don't know if anybody can believe that because the year has been running. And boy, have we had a year in cycling esports. Today, well, we've got an absolute cracker of a programme for you. Since becoming NeXT, presented by Enshored in 2022, the team secured back-to-back championships in the Zwift Premier Division. Following that success, they transitioned to the Grand Prix, where they made the podium every season except one. Currently in the Zwift World Series, the team is leading the standings in the men's elite race. NeXT, powered by Enshored, roster includes five national champions, including Brian Duffy from the USA, Thomas Thrall from Canada, Richard Barry from Ireland, Dan Turek from the Czech Republic, and Nikola Turkova from the Czech Republic as well. Historically, they've also had Scott Cantazzaro from the USA, and recently, their latest signing, the 2023 Esports World Champion from Denmark, Bjorn Andreasen, has joined the team. They've also had, four finalists at the 2024 World Championships in the men's race. And let's not forget, Andreasen hadn't joined the team then. That's a phenomenal lineup, Chris. Over the last three World Championships, NeXT, presented by Enshored, has represented at least 6 different nations, always securing at least one rider in the top 10. It is a phenomenal performance and roster when you look at it that way, Chris.
It's true. The results are undeniable, and they have been for years with NeXT presented by Enshored. But what I'm really interested in learning are the inner workings behind the team's success. How does a team balance optimizing athletic performance with ensuring rider safety, advocacy, legitimacy, and setting industry standards? And how are they building a business foundation that not only supports sponsorships, but also helps raise the profile of the athletes and grow the sport?
Well, we have the president of NeXT, presented by Enshored. If you haven't guessed already who our guest is for episode 61, welcome Greg Abbott. Greg, it's fabulous to have you with us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, should we just start off by giving our listeners a little bit of background information into the team? Give us your elevator pitch, the short version on how you got into cycling esports and then how it went forward from there.
So I was a cyclist for most of my life. I raced as a junior. I was a Cat 1. My racing life kind of came to an abrupt end when I had discovered a heart defect and a hip defect that had to be treated. And I actually had a big pause from cycling as a competitive outlet. And like so many people got into this because of the pandemic, right? Like suddenly I couldn't go to the gym or do other things, but Zwift was there. I still had bikes, part of that wave of rediscovering it then. I say rediscovering because I was actually a Zwift beta user. I had an account that had sat dormant for quite some time. But at the early days of Jarvis Island, when it was first starting out, but then hadn't touched it in years. And I think when this huge influx of people came into the sport, there were obviously teams that had been there, community that had been developing on its own right well before then. But how could they deal with this sudden explosion of new users? There wasn't a home for everybody. There was a lot of Zwift orphans. And as the population of users got bigger, that bell curve of talent distribution meant there was just that many more really top level competitors who didn't have a home. And I think that set of circumstances combined with the Zwift Grand Prix launching created a whole lot of new teams, and we sort of fall into that bucket as well.
So what was the light bulb moment? There's a big gap between being an elite athlete or being in that community and then taking on the responsibility of forming a team.
So I think, because we're a team that we combined with another established team, like sort of midway through this process, there's more than one origin story, right? Like this came together through a lot of different networks so I guess my origin story in this is that I ran like a cycling meme account, and all the people who did that, like created meetups on Zwift, and like we put a team together. It was just like as a laugh, right? Like we were just going to do the Grand Prix, and we were okay, and because Ashton Lambie followed all the accounts. He came with us a couple of Tuesday nights, and but we knew, who had friends who were like working in other teams, and realized like we could probably be a little bit more competitive if we took it more seriously. So I'm based in DC, and so is Scott Catanzaro, and he was racing with Brian Duffy and Greg Rosicki at Relentless at the time, and they were doing really well, but wanted to focus on a more elite pathway. We had some pretty good guys, and that's sort of how I got to meet Brian. And that was like the first time we sort of like merged some different cultures, different approaches to things. Prior to esports, I also ran a pretty large USA cycling club. We'd been a club of the year, had an elite program, had a really extensive juniors program. So I had a lot of experience running a team. And I kind of missed doing that. And the prospect of starting something from scratch and something that was just developing, really at that time, it was such a team-centric sport too. The format that mattered was ZRL and the Premier Division, and it had a team structure that kind of suppressed ego. Everyone was in it together, and it gave this built-in kind of camaraderie that the individual ambitions sort of fell to the wayside. And I think just for everyone's mental health, we needed that. We were all had been so isolated. It became this way of having human contact outside of your home, the way that everyone dealt with anxiety at that time. Some channeled into healthy things and some didn't. And this was really just a godsend for so many people that we had this. And I joke that we trauma bonded, right? This group became so close because we just had this time and energy on our hands to just pour into it. And myself, I had too much time on my hands and ran away with itself. It snowballed really quick.
So what were the founding principles, Greg? The vision, the mission when you started?
Because it was a team-centric discipline at the time, and we thought that was the direction it was largely going, we saw that there was this opportunity to avoid the pitfalls that I think real-life cycling has. We wanted to have a team identity that wasn't just absorbed by your sponsors, because all that stuff sort of comes and goes. As a sport, it wasn't in a place where that was a thing yet, but it also seemed like it could be. And so we wanted to create an organization that had its own brand that you then wanted to find support that wanted to be associated with the brand that we established, rather than having an identity subsumed by the sponsor being the title, having our own palette and design and sort of concept of what that team looks like. So that was important to us from the onset. I think it took us a long time to probably more emails than any other topic that year, figuring out color scheme and logo, sort of a visual representation. Really fortunate. A friend of mine from my college racing days owns a small cycling custom clothing company called Cutaway, and he does phenomenal design work. And so we partnered with them really early, provided us with some basic stuff to get started so we could at least feel just having a jersey just creates a sense of this is real now. And I think that really helped early on. And it created this visual identity that we could all rally around. So that was a big thing, is just sort of setting a terms from the onset that this is how things would work. And then from there, it was just sort of branching out and trying to find support where it existed. I thought in esports, there is an opportunity, look at how to maximize the equipment and gear in a different way. We were really obsessed on chainline efficiencies and how to save every watt that you can. I had a friend is the CEO of Kogel. It's a ceramic bearing company, and they were supporters really early on. They helped us to get all this gear to find every watt that you could, right? Don't lose anything to just having a dirty chain, or the smoothest running bearings that we could find. Similarly, with Cutaway, we started actually making our own kits with them, finding the things that worked right, knowing that we had to do these verified weigh-ins. We were making the lightest kit possible. So our under kit has no pockets, no zippers, no, saved 150 grams, which pretty impressive for just a jersey. So all these things, we were looking for ways to maximize it. It's further down the line where we got the significant sponsor in Enshored that comes as a result of a merger that happens later. And I tell the CEO of Enshored, he's very embedded into the team. He's in our Discord and is incredibly supportive. The chance he took on us, will never be more thankful for anything. He had a team that was entirely branded with his name, and he took a chance on our vision to have it be a team that has its own visual identity and its own brand to be associated with us instead. And I think it paid off. I think we ended up getting the Enshored name said on a lot of broadcasts, reached a lot of people that way. But he rolled the dice on us, and we're just incredibly thankful.
Yeah, that's a great story, Greg, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. As the president of NeXT, presented by Enshored, what is your role now, and how is the management structured from that perspective?
Okay, so we incorporated as a not-for-profit corporation, and this was a function of just becoming a more professionalized organization. When the team is winning cash prizes, we didn't want any of our riders to be surprised with a tax bill at the end of that. We also were able to provide some rider support on equipment and clothing and some stipends. There's a significant time commitment to doing these things, right? People are taking time off of work, or they're monitoring their diet to make sure they're not eating too much salt the day before to make these to get a good weigh. We put a lot on these guys, and so we try to make sure that offset the hard costs that come along with that, because they make a lot of personal life sacrifices. This allows us to open bank accounts, be able to do shipping accounts, because we got equipment to people. We're in 11 countries all told, so just getting kit to people is difficult. Probably none more than Barney. Like, it is just not easy to get stuff to New Zealand from the US. So all those things just led us to have that kind of structure in order to file that incorporation. So we have the president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, regular meeting requirements. They all had to file bylaws. We kept them pretty simple. What it really amounts to is we have a small core of leadership within the team that would include myself and Brian. Liz Van Houweling as the representing our women's team, somebody on the team who represents the community racing, a treasurer and a secretary, and just making sure we're filing our taxes and paying our bills, which it's kind of crazy that this hobby has bills to pay. That's how it goes. The responsibilities are relatively informal. People take on the things that make sense for them. And for everybody here, this is a side project. We all have day jobs for the most part. We're moms and dads. We have other things going on, and sometimes life subsumes you. So we're really flexible in having other people pick up slack when somebody has more important things going on in their life.
Yeah, so you talked there about Liz being on representing the women's team, and that women's team you expanded to include it in 2023. Many teams have had, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Many teams have had representation from the start. Some teams are specifically women's only teams. I can think of Aonian as one. Mm-hmm. What was it that was important for you to make that move and bring on the women's team in 2023 alongside the men's team?
So Enshored had a women's team at the time that we merged, but we hadn't. And that wasn't a function of anything other than it just having been a bunch of guys who were friends being the foundation of creating the team. And since we weren't bringing that to the table in a merge, the idea was that the Enshored branding would exist with our women's team. But in hindsight, that was the wrong idea, because it felt like there was a separation, and all those riders ended up going to other places, because I think that it was a bad to try to do it that way, like to have not integrated everybody at that time. So I think there was always a desire to have a women's program and to support equal opportunity in the sport. And then once that we realized that mistake, it had been on our radar from the beginning, but actually creating it is difficult to do that from scratch. And so we sort of knew to do it, we were going to need somebody to anchor that program. And there are a lot of our athletes who work with Alex Code. With so many athletes who work through him, you meet a lot of people within the same space. And I think there's the opportunity to start something from scratch, and she's taken on a lot to do that. One of the biggest challenges is the athlete pool is smaller in the women's side of the sport, for sure. And we see a lot of musical chairs within rosters. We were hoping to try to get some anchoring riders with experience, but then also reach out to riders who didn't have specific esport experience, because I think the talent pool of people who would be good at it is much, much larger than the number of participants currently in it. I can take on to figure out how to crack that nut. How do we make it more appealing, bring more people into it? It's incumbent on all of us to try to appeal to more people and really highlight how fun it is. So that's it in a nutshell. That Liz really became our anchor and did a lot of recruiting, and is currently still doing a lot of recruiting. We brought a couple of new riders on recently. We've had just an absolute breakout year with Nicole Meyer in the women's side of things in the World Series. I don't know if you watched the Restart Series this weekend. Yeah. She was phenomenal. And also we sort of had a guest riding from Lucy Charles Barclay this year in the Zwift World Series, which was super cool. It's gaining momentum. We're committed to putting the same resources and energy into the women's team as we do to the men's team. Like from the onset, it was clear that allocation, the support for riders would match everything that we do for the men.
Before we get into some of the reasons why you're so successful from a more in-depth approach, you've been dominant at times and you're always there in critical moments. What would you say is the secret of NeXT success?
Really, it's the sense of this team being a place that is there for its riders from the onset. I think we've always punched above our weight. If on paper, if you just put all of our riders in a lab with other teams, there are riders who are just like phenomenally talented competing in this space, and I feel like we don't have, I'm trying to think how to say this right. Our guys are incredible, don't get me wrong, but like it's not this like mind-blowing, like, can you believe this power test kind of numbers, right? We provide an environment where I think there's a lot of selflessness. There's people who really are invested in the success of everybody else on that team. I think there's like an emotional support network to it. I think this team is really close. It's a place where there's as much race chat as there is marriage and parenthood and life stress kind of conversation going on as well. It's a support network. And I think everybody knows that we really do care about everybody who is part of it. I think in the days where the team scoring was the focus too, that also helps to eliminate ego in a sport, that when there's a shift toward individualized prizes or individualized reward or focus in the scoring, then you have to balance those competing ambitions. So I think like having come up in a time when the team was the focus, that's sort of like just really put into the core of who we are. In the World Series, our goal is focused on the team standings more so than any of the individual ones. That's just sort of how we approach everything.
Do you know, Greg, that's really interesting talking about that team environment and that focus on the team standings, because you talked about some tangible benefits to the ride, things like sending kit around the world and the challenges with that, that emotional support that the riders give each other and the team give everybody. Would you say there was one thing that had contributed to the overall development of the team and its success, or would you say it was a mix of all of the things you've been talking about so far?
I'd say a mix of that, and remiss to have not mentioned that I think the thing that we do better than most other teams is homework. We are probably the most analytical when it comes to approaching the race book. There were Grand Prix events where we had figured out the scoring in a way where we go into there was an elimination round once where we went into the last round without needing to score another point to have already won the entire thing because we had sort of figured out how to game it. The degree to which we dive into the race book and understand the scoring and give assignments, like we could go in with a real plan. All plans fall apart when you first contact with the enemy, but everyone understands their role and intuits what to do when things go wrong. We're always good about having a director. It's usually me to keep calm, reset, adapt to whatever has happened, and keep everybody focused on the task at hand. So that is also a critical part as well.
Yeah.
And I'll credit Brian for being the most analytical person I have ever met.
You won't believe how many riders around the world never read the race book.
It's
And not just in cycling esports.
Yeah, doing the homework really, really matters.
You spoke about punching above your weight, and being at the top, people are always taking shots at you. That often means dealing with criticism, claims of impropriety. How do you address those challenges on behalf of your racers and advocate for them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult thing. I think when you're up and coming, you're not under that level of scrutiny. But once we had an undefeated season, right? And suddenly there's a lot of eyes on us. And behind the scenes, a number of our riders were asked to do additional verification. And we've had annulments based on technical errors happening. There was an instance with like the H3 trainers or H4 trainers, right? They were removed from a qualified device because, the spikes that were happening that through no rider's fault. Things like that happen, and you just have to sort of brush that off. And I think people realize that that's, well beyond anybody's control. Community spends too much time throwing accusation or talking about the problems. It doesn't drag down the person you're suspicious of. It drags down the sport. It drives me nuts that Cycling News doesn't cover esports until they show that there's a cancellation because of a trainer problem, right? They didn't cover it, the British National Championships, when it happened, but when there was a problem, then it gets all this article. And then it reinforces to the average user who sees the person, someone doing 7 watts per kilo for 30 minutes or something in a Zwift race. So it just reinforces this perception that none of this is legitimate. And so the line we want to walk here is you want to be not doing the things that impugn the sport or continue to keep doubt or suspicion to the people that you want to grow and become part of it. But at the same time, wanting to have strong controls and abide by all the different processes to verify your athletes. So as a sort of standing order within the team is, if you have an annulment that is just data-based, something went wrong with it technically, don't make a big deal about it. We take it on the chin and move on. We tell all of our riders not to engage in forums and speculation. Just don't do that. Even if you have suspicions about a rider, congratulate everybody at the end of the race, outwardly. There's no upside to mudslinging. And we do have controls in place. And I think it's important that we don't vigilante everything that goes wrong. The community wanted to police the efforts, and we created essentially police within the events. Let them do that job. And I think we have to know that that's the best we're going to get for whatever shortcomings there are. And there still are a lot within just the data behind what we're doing, right? The variances between devices, the quality control. We're trying to make a very precise sport on relatively imprecise equipment that wasn't designed for this use case. So there's some amount of this that we have to accept that there is a gray area, and that we have, at least in the top level of the sport, we put controls into place, and we have to put faith in those things to do what they're meant to do. Within the team, there'd be a zero tolerance policy. If we found someone purposely trying to manipulate or cheat or do anything that would damage the reputation of the team, our sponsors, or the sport itself.
You mentioned that zero tolerance policy. Do you actually have a code of conduct?
On my to-do list, that is a topic of conversation that we haven't actually codified yet. We've not had instances of an elite rider giving us a reason to have to remove them from the team. We should get ahead of that before anything like that happens. But I also don't see any of our riders doing something so untoward.
Well, talking about riders, you've just added former world champion Bjorn Andreasen to the team.
Yeah.
I saw the Kit Swag poster that he put out on social media earlier on this week. He's obviously a very successful racer at world level. But beyond results, what other qualities do you prioritise when recruiting?
Yeah, so I think it's not difficult for us to recruit in the perch that we were kind of sitting on. We get way more people asking us to join than we could possibly take on. And so we have the luxury of being fairly selective and really only results driven, just about the competitive advantage and winning all the time. But really, it's just about personality and fit. I think that there's any number of people who could join this team, and the way that we support and push each other to be better elevates their game. We've had Marcus Duval on the team, for example, came in just as a community rider, and he is continually qualifying into the Zwift World Series events and putting up good results in them. Phenomenal that he started as just a guy that we saw on Tuesday nights, but got along well with him. He fit in, and he just keeps getting better and better. With Bjorn, he'd been friendly with some of our riders and floated the idea. And when we had a bunch of guys out in Abu Dhabi, feel him out. What's he like? And fit in instantly. He's good natured and well humored. And I think he had come from a team that had a very similar circumstance to NeXT's formation, where we're really close, but they didn't follow up into the elite tier. And I think we provided an environment that I think he was missing. It's been great. He dove right in.
He rode so well on the Echelon Racing League, the first round. When he went away from the Chase group, he was riding brilliantly there as well.
Yeah, I mean, he's
on some really good form.
One of the things I really loved about the idea of having Bjorn come in is that, aside from being just a phenomenally strong athlete, is I really appreciate tactically savvy athletes. So his world championship win saw and seized an opportunity to let Group 2 syndrome just let him run away with that world championship. Honestly, I appreciate smart racing more than I appreciate displays of strength. I think I was never the strongest racer, but I was always tactically pretty savvy. And seeing that, it also highlights that this is not just an exercise competition. The tactics and the gameplay, the mental aspects of this is what makes it a real sport. It's not just something we can determine with a power meter and a scale who the best indoor rider is.
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it, hearing you say that, because here in the UK, Mark Cavendish has just had a Lifetime Achievement Award from Sports Personality of the Year, which is a big thing here in the UK. But constantly, when he's been on the media recently, he's been talking about the fact that he's not the most powerful athlete. He doesn't have the best data, but he always could see a gap. He used the tactics, he used the strategy, and that's how he won 35 stage,
Yeah.
and I agree. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it plays right the way across cycling disciplines, whether you're a Tour de France rider or whether you're racing on Zwift, the tactics and the strategy are just as, or if not more important than the numbers you can put out through those pedals.
I think so. That's if racing didn't have that wild card, if there wasn't that other intangible, the things that aren't just something you can measure in a lab, why would we watch? You need human drama to make it a sport. Otherwise, it's people working out.
On the flip side of that, there's a theory of belief in the community that if a racer doesn't have real world results, that they can't legitimize their cycling esports results. How do you feel about that? And do you consider that when recruiting or?
Yeah. So I think it's one of these things where people want to have it both ways, right? Like they want to be able to say like, oh, esports can be a way for discovering the sport, and that like it can be a discipline unto itself. But then if you succeed under those terms, immediately it arouses suspicion because you don't have outside history. We get a bit of that with over the years. Tom was an elite canoe racer, was an Olympic hopeful for Canada, discovered cycling just shortly before the pandemic, and like the outdoor Palmares just didn't exist, but he was an elite athlete. And I think over time it's like, how many times can this guy go to an in-person event or be verified and doing all these things? And so I think over time that becomes self-evident. Yeah, I don't want this to be a thing where if you don't have an outside pedigree, you can't be believable. I do think we need to let the commissaires sort out the verification process. But at the same time, extraordinary performance needs to be validated, and ought to be, just because this is the most untapped talent resource discovery system in the world. If people really are putting out world-class numbers doing this, Federation should probably want to know about that. I don't want to buy into this idea that you need to have that outside pedigree, but I think if you don't, a certain level of scrutiny is expected, and hopefully riders take that as almost as a compliment. If you're getting that much attention, it's for a reason, right? It's tough if people don't believe the legitimacy of a rider.
I certainly agree. And when you think about the creation of cycling esports and cycling esports being a unique sport, then the goal in my mind is to have athletes that have grown up as cycling esports riders. Those riders won't have outdoor real world results because they've prioritized racing indoors and becoming cycling esports athletes. By supporting that theory of belief, you're basically hammering a death nail into the sport. Community, sometimes is very strong in their beliefs. I always wonder what it would be like if they were more unified and they had a more unified voice. Do you support the creation of a racers union? And if so, how do you feel that would be structured?
I have not thought about structure. I think having racers have a unified voice in really a melange of different interests here. The racers really have very little power in the say in the direction that the sport is going, right? Like it's largely concentrated in the platforms. The dynamic between a governing body and the platforms is really similar to road cycling with ASO, and has so much more power over the calendar than the UCI does. But it doesn't mean they don't have any levers to pull. I think the concerns that riders in esports have are honestly less severe than in IRL athletes, right? Like we're not that concerned about road furniture and cars and the kind of safety problems that they have. And so I don't think the stakes are quite as high yet, but I think having a means for riders and teams to be able to communicate some of the things that they'd like to see, the direction they want it to go, probably clear from previous statements. I think the team focus in esports is an important thing that gets lost in the top events. There's only one world champion. It doesn't reflect the way that a lot of the racing happens. The finals still sort of emulate what happens outside, but the way that the biggest community racing events work are very team focused. And so there's a disconnect between how most people experience the sport and what the top prizes in the sport are looking like now. I do think having some standards around riders wanting to have standards around verification, uniform, wanting equipment manufacturers to be in this conversation too, upping the level of what the equipment can provide for the expectations that we have as competitors. Like there's still that gap that hasn't been bridged. Personally, I'd love to see equipment that uses real power meters and strain gauges, not using calculated estimates based off of belt drive tension. I think we're asking the trainers to do too much to be a verified power source, a resistance changing device, a cadence sensor. The more we can isolate and have specific measurements for those things, I think the more accurate all of this stuff could be. It'd be a big undertaking. I'd want to take part. I've not really put a lot of thought into what a governance structure or what even the priorities of that community would be. But for sure, we're at a point now where, as it's growing, the voices at the table have been fairly limited. For the fault of nobody. I'm not casting blame on anybody, right? It's just as it's grown, you've sort of realized who needs to be in that tent, and maybe this is the next step.
It's been an emerging and a rapidly growing discipline, isn't it? And there comes a tipping point, doesn't there, as all sports grow, that actually representation needs to be wider, etc. What do you think about, I mean, you touched briefly there on the team bit, in terms of a racers union, platforms, event organisers, team management. What role do you think team management may play at the table? Do you think they're separate to a racers union or involved within the racers union?
I think involved in. The team element is largely not a thing on one platform of the dominant ones. I don't know how you fit that into MyWhoosh. It's a great platform, but we had a handful of guys in Echelon Racing League. We took second, third, fourth, and fifth. Man, Hayden had a great ride and caught everybody sleeping early on, but we had everybody wear the same kit, but it's not clear to the announcers that's not showing this is the team that they're all representing. I don't think everybody at that point knew that Bjorn was with us, right? And so I'd like to see that platform embrace more team stuff. They love to have in-game kits and all that sort of stuff that really helps build excitement on the established teams to want to be regular participants in that platform. And I hope they get there. I can't imagine they have a reason not to want to do things that encourage increased participation. But it's not uniform on what these structures look like. The UCI has been largely focused just on the World Championships because there's not a calendar. There's not a UCI series of events that have the same, because that's like an individual title. They're focused rightly so on the event and the federations and the processes for getting in there. I actually did message UCI hoping that they would use some of their authority to create reciprocity across platforms on champions kits. It's a shame that I don't want to be in a situation, right, where the US champion is going to be named on MyWhoosh this year to then have no one being able to wear the stars and stripes in Zwift. And conversely, Dan Turek won his national championship on MyWhoosh and he doesn't have a kit in Zwift. So having the tender to apply for a UCI sanctioned event, like the Esports Olympics or the UCI World Championships required having that reciprocity would be huge for teams and athletes.
I specifically asked Zwift that question. They told me that, there's no reason why we wouldn't have reciprocity across platforms as far as kits go for World Championships. Why it hasn't happened, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, but I was told that they do intend to do that.
That's great. And we flagged that early with them. But I'm sure it's a process. It's a lot of design time going into making a kit for every country. We had a great win this year in the World Series by Dan Turek, and he's got a great in-life Czech Champions kit, but it wasn't in the game. So that's a little bit sad for us, but it's great to hear that they're open to it, and hopefully that's the same on all the platforms, right? We've talked about Whoosh, but we've not mentioned to the Training Peaks. What's it called?
Virtual.
Yeah, I haven't gotten used to it since it ceased to be Indie Velo. But yeah, it's the sort of thing that I think everyone should want to embrace. It makes every event looks better when you can highlight that there is a national champion in it or a world champion in it, right? You want to see those colors it elevates the event, no matter what platform it's on.
I'm going to change tact a little bit, Greg, because I want to talk to you about sponsorship and partnerships, because obviously you were talking earlier on about mergers and the sponsors and those types of things. So NeXT you're not only successful on the course, but in terms of you're successful in terms of ensuring those sponsors and those partnerships. What's your pitch to potential sponsors? How do you quantify the value of the sport? How do you bring on, or what do you look for in a new sponsor?
So there's not a great model for this. I think the pitch fundamentally boils down to growth potential, right? This is a space that is relatively untapped, and you can be into it on the early side to create a positive association with users in this space. So I can speak to the sponsorships that we currently have. So being the primary one, so their business is in providing tech companies with programming services. So they do things like having monitoring and content moderation on video game platforms, and just like when you need a lot of code written for something specifically, they can provide those services to mostly aimed at startups. And so I think for them, like, is if there's growth here, having a name associated with them, if they're looking for contracts with other places, it makes a lot of sense. But that's a rare thing to find. So many cycling sponsorships, not just for esports, but all cycling, it really comes down to if there's leadership that likes the sport, right? Ian, the CEO of Enshored, is a passionate cyclist, and he comes to our team camp, right? He rides with us. He's fully immersed in it and been so incredibly supportive. I think there is a business case for why he would be involved, but I don't think it happens if you don't come from a place where you already care about the sport. Right. And so like that, it's a unicorn in the space to have a non-cycling industry supporter, because everything else has been people that are or companies that are sort of in the industry already. And we do have great sponsors that are in the industry. Like I mentioned, Cutaway doing a kit with us, Kogel doing like ceramic bearings and things. Scott Catanzaro works for Cannondale, and they've come on as a supporter as well. Again, Scott really does the pitch to sponsors at this point. Demonstrating the ways that we get eyeballs is really it. So the number of streams, the number of people that watch the events, the number of people that watch and engage, and even just like Barney's stream, right? Like he's got a fair number of followers, and highlighting how interactive it is. It's not just passive viewing, that like there's a way that you can have direct rider engagement in real time with them. Ashton Lambie is still in the Discord. He's moved on to doing some other projects in his life, but when he was hosting a regular series on Zwift for Zip, when he was absent, he'd have some of our guys fill in, and we could have the recordings of Barney leading Ashton's ride, and the number of questions that he got from the people writing about the racing world it's really cool, right? Like, you really demonstrate that the people who are in this audience are like engaged with it, and you have this ability to interact with them in a way that's not common in pretty much any other sport. The challenge for us is really getting good data on users and the eyeballs. We don't have consistent data on how many people are watching things live and how many people are rewatching things, data that GCN had about their audience share that like wasn't publicly available. So the ability for teams to take the data on how many people we're reaching and then leverage that to get new support into this ecosystem. I think having a little bit more sharing of that kind of information would help teams to leverage that and bring in more support and more interest to the space.
It's an interesting question because you as a team want to raise the profile of the team for your sponsors. But it seems that a large part of building the sport and building this team is on the backs of the athletes. So you spoke about the national championships and the jerseys. I wonder if there are ever conversations about how to leverage those jerseys or how to be a better influencer, because those are numbers that you can easily, how many followers does the racer have? How many impressions do they have on their social media? Do you look to that as a way to train and raise the profile?
Yeah, we do. And I'll be a little, it's kind of silly. Like I said, we're mostly moms and dads and middle-aged riders who, the amount of time that I think Brian has posted 3 things on Instagram his entire life, there's a generation gap in who like the top performers are. And you can see the people who have built like a following that are very engaged in social media. Like Leo's a good example, like where he's like puts out a lot of content and gets a lot of followers, and it's good stuff. And we have a lot of personalities that haven't embraced that yet. And it's hard to make that. If you tell everyone they have like a minimum number of posts to create and try to force them to drive engagement, you can always tell when it feels fake, right? Like you want people to appear genuine. Barney is our best Twitch personality, for example, and getting the quantifying his particular audience is pretty easy. A lot of our guys just don't have like desire to be a big social media presence. And then, the team has contracted to have people do some posts for us. We haven't been doing it this year, but we've had some like good intro videos and done some good content here or there. But social media is not an afterthought. If you're working in a company and like hand that off to an intern, it's not going to go well. It is at this point a professionalized industry. It takes planning, it takes skill, it takes creativity. It's something you have to put real resources into to make grow. We're fortunate to have a fair amount of support and we can put some into that, but it's the full-time job and keeping on top of it is difficult.
Yeah, it is one of those things, isn't it? And no hands up around the table about who else is always also probably past the age of good social media content.
Yeah, my personal social media is just like pretty much non-existent at this point. And I don't think I'm alone in my age cohort, and that's like a challenge for the sport too. I think it's become a place where you get some very elite athletes, but there are people who may have missed their window on turning a professional in real life, or this is a second life as an athlete. Brian was a professional triathlete. A lot of riders who had been pretty good in a sport in a previous life, and this is a thing that they're doing now, because you can do it while you have a day job and a family. You can scratch that competitive itch. But I totally also get that for 20-something rider who has outdoor ambitions, this isn't the place where you want to go right now. I think that could be improved by making it more of a talent identification process. Like if a U23 champion got an automatic talent ID invite by USAC, give an incentive to leverage esport as a way of career growth for younger riders, I think is the only way that we're going to start seeing a downward shift in the average age of the competitors. And then this butts up with, online privacy and safety concerns for juniors, right? Like you can't get an account in Zwift now below, I forget what age it is now. It's 16, right? Yeah. So it's pretty limiting on when you can start and when you might be at the peak interest level.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's the flip side that actually it gives athletes a second athletic career. There is a real flip side to it, which I think is really interesting.
Don't get me wrong, we love that. It's been an amazing thing for the athlete pool that we have, but a lot of our internal management discussion is about recognizing that it's probably fleeting, that we have a deep roster, but at any given moment, somebody's life could alter in a way that makes it hard for them to continue to compete as regularly as they. It's tough to do this year in and year out consistently when you have more things happening in your life to focus on. We've been fortunate to have a big enough depth of talent on our roster that if somebody is off, right, like somebody has something come up that makes racing to go to the back burner, we have the depth to deal with that. Not every team does. And so could be an incredible challenge. That can end the season, really. They can really drop the profile of the team really quickly if you're reliant on just one or two riders to always be your performers. It's a constant conversation about how do we bring in people who are younger than our average, that like a consistent amount of time to dedicate to this over the next few years. Bjorn is a great example. He's right in the sweet spot where he's still quite young, but probably too old for the World Tour to be interested in how strong he is, right? Because like they tend to invest in younger and younger riders these days, but he's really dragging down the average age of our lineup. So there are people in that sweet spot, but there's not a ton.
Yeah, those feeding UCI teams are taking them so early now. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
It really, really is. It's a big shift. Talking about successful teams, because you have been one of the most successful teams in Zwift's elite cycling esports history. You've given us hints about how you feel about the trend currently to moving away from team-based racing in the Zwift Games and the Zwift World Series. I'm making an assumption you would really like to see that come back and strengthen.
I think it's important to have a balance, right? Because I think there are people in the community that don't have a team that's going to elevate as a team to move up, right? We really loved the idea of it being like a soccer league structure when the Zwift Grand Prix first came out, right? We had to earn our way in, right? We started in community races and we had to like make it through a playoff and get through, and it's fun. Our playoff to get in, we got in with BZR, which now Abus Synergy, right? Like we've been doing battle with that team for so long. We had to get into the Premier League with them, and like when we haven't won championships, we're usually like it's a loss to them by a point, right? Like it's always like this battle. Love that we were able to do that and have this team that like we keep this like long-term and really good cordial rivalry, right? Like it's just great racing with them, but it required having teams to elevate all of these riders on. And if you weren't associated with those teams, you kind of get left behind. And so having pathways for individual riders to get through is important. But at the same time, what really, I think, sells the sport to more people is having it be team focused, right? Like we're all on Discord with earpieces. A lot of ways it's more like playing Call of Duty than it is going out for a ride. You can't communicate like that on the open road in the same way. That's the thing that really, I think, makes esports appealing. If you don't have a sense of camaraderie with it, if you're just racing against a stranger with no real human interaction, it loses some of its charm. I think cycling in any capacity it's a social event. Road culture is cafe stops, and mountain bike culture is like parking lot beers, right? Like there's community aspects to every kind of cycling. And if we don't find ways for esport to find its own way to do that, I think it comes at the detriment of growth of the sport.
We've spoke about MyWhoosh, and we're speaking about the team element now, and they certainly have invested a lot into elite racing, and they've raised their profile, and it's become a legitimate, very popular platform for elite racers. But then again, your team isn't as well represented as far as racers and as a team on the platform. Can you explain why that is?
We're working on it. The races that matter most there really hit some difficult time zones for a lot of, like, a predominantly US-based team. That weigh-in window starts in the middle of the night for a lot of guys. And if they're West Coast, if you're on this point, you'd almost have to stay up all night to do the race, right? If the weigh-in's at like 1 a.m. your time. So what I hear, they're working on having comparable events that'll hit other time zones. That would be a big part of it. Having Echelon happening on weekends has gotten more of our people to jump into that fray as well. So I think that's the biggest hurdle. I've enjoyed the time that I spend on MyWhoosh. It's a really cool platform. I think what I would love to see more is having community tools, ways to connect with other people in a more meaningful way there. I know they've been really focused on elite racing, and elite racers you can get to come over. It's a pretty simple formula. There's prize money here and you're very good at this. You're going to go take that opportunity. But I think you still see elite racers go there for the events, but don't spend time there training, right? They're not necessarily putting all their volume training time in there because you have like a pre-existing community in this other space. There's ways to engage with people in this other space that I think you need to have both of these things. I think if esports are going to grow, all populations fall on a bell curve. If your focus is on elite racing, if you want to have more elite racers, grow the overall pot. That's the only way you're going to find more of them. You're not going to just be able to pluck them from obscurity. Finding the balance between those competing elements, that's really where I think the sport grows.
Well, that's really interesting, and I shall look forward to 2025 and seeing you growing on that race platform as well. But just for our listeners, there are indeed going to be updates to the MyWhoosh Sunday Race Club from 5th of January. More opportunities for individual athletes and teams to be successful and get rewarded. Potential format changes, I understand, and I would be putting a call out to the community to get those power passport tests done if you want to be involved, because that bell curve, Greg, might be changing slightly.
Excellent.
Which should be really good.
We're all for there being multiple platforms and competing places. We want to be in all these spaces, but all these places are still growing and habits are hard to break. But wherever there is an opportunity to do top tier racing, we're gonna have people making that a foray into it.
Yeah, and that's the exciting thing, isn't it? Because it is growing, it is changing, it's evolving, and it's moving forward, and everybody's getting involved, which is fabulous.
Yeah, I tried really hard to get that official announcement, which will be out next week from what I understand. So some pretty cool changes from what my sources indicate.
Looking forward to hearing about it.
Greg, this conversation has been extremely insightful and we really appreciate it. I just want to just wrap up with one question for you, because I think it'll tie in the whole conversation. What do you feel is your biggest accomplishment as the president of NeXT? And what do you think is NeXT's impact on cycling esports?
Oh, man, that's more introspective than I was prepared to be. I mean, there's been a lot of sporting success, right? And we've got a lot of really cool kits hanging on walls as a result, a number of champions. And, to go by the numbers of the number of countries that have been represented by our team in like this fledgling and up-and-coming sport, all that, there's an immense amount of pride in. What I'm really proud of more than anything is just this community that we've created, the sense that everybody that's been part of it, been with us through all this time, feels like we created a community and a support network, taken something that was a casual hobby to a real passion for a lot of people, and that a lot of everyone who's been involved has a home here. That's why I wouldn't trade it for the world. If we never won another title, I wouldn't mind, as long as I still got to have a never-ending pinging notifications from just a phenomenal group of people, like based on all over the world that we share an interest with. Like, that's what matters the most.
Oh, Chris, I just think we should draw a line there because the sentiment is just fabulous.
Absolutely. I agree. Thanks so much, Greg. It was really great. I appreciate it. It's taken a long time for me to meet you, but it was worth the wait. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. It was really a pleasure. And please stay in touch. If ever anything that we can do to help you all out, we're here.
Oh, thank you ever so much. You can subscribe to the Virtual Velo podcast on your favourite podcast provider and, of course, YouTube. You can follow me, Emma Martin, on Instagram at biking_Emma. You can follow Chris at the Zwift. You can catch me putting words to the action this Saturday. It's round 2 of the Echelon Racing League. And of course, on Sunday, I shall be covering the Sunday Race Club on MyWhoosh. You can head over to thezmunicay.com and sign up for the bi-monthly newsletter to support independent cycling esports journalism. We've also got, in 2025, yet more impactful guests from the world of cycling esports joining us, including Gabby Guerra, Carla Williams, Birdie and Driscoll, and Ariel Verhaeren. Yes, those last 3 are indeed from the Ionian race team. CVR founder Frank Garcia, 2028's Nicola Kramer, and Cycling Canada's Josh Peacock. It is a packed lineup early next year, and Chris and I are both looking forward to that. Don't forget that update to the MyWhoosh Sunday Race Club for the first race of the new year in January. Keep your eyes peeled. That will be coming out shortly, and get that Power Passport test done if you want to get on that start line. Greg, thank you ever so much for joining us for the last show for 2024. I've had my Christmas earrings on the whole time. Just a little festive feeling. Thank you ever so much for joining us, everybody. Stay safe, enjoy your cycling, and have a great finale to 2024.